Keith Cavers, who is going to be talking about the ballet Giselle. But before I hand over to James, which is going to introduce them properly, a couple of notices. We will be having wine at the end, which is at the back, and do pick up some leaflets for our next few lectures. Our next one is on the 7th of February, and it's Dan Rebellato with the title, The Curtain Will Remain Up, Naturalist Theatre and the Problem of Pornography. So can't miss that one, it's going to be great. But I'll now hand over to Jane, thank you very much.
Well, good evening, it's a great pleasure to introduce Keith tonight. Keith describes himself as a dance archaeologist. Not many people who take those descriptions, and of course digging up Giselle is obviously a very appropriate subject for him. I could go through sort of the formal bit about how he trained initially as a stage manager at RADA, also studied at Camberwell College of Art, looking particularly at prints and drawings, and his real fascination with iconography. One of the things I think is really important about Keith, and it's one of the things I value about his friendship, is he's someone who's constantly sharing information with other people. Not only that, he is constantly going back, looking at sources, reassessing them, and actually sort of making new discoveries. He looks more at pictures than most people do, I think, but I think it's one of the things that is often undervalued, the illustration. He has turned his love of prints and drawings into a profession, and so he deals commercially also in prints, which is one way of spending your time doing what you love. And I have heard him speak about Giselle before, and I'm convinced I shall learn a great deal more today that I didn't know, because of the way he goes on and discovers and unearths more. So it's our opportunity to discover if anything we see on stage today under the title of Giselle has any resemblance to what may have happened in the 1840s. Thank you very much, Keith.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, I do spend my life looking at pictures. Generally, on an ordinary day, I look at 3, 4, perhaps 5,000 pictures. Any picture that comes up on French eBay, I look at, regardless. I see loads of dross, but it's always the hope that I will find that one diamond, and I have, that keeps me going. Digging up Giselle. Well, last year, we lost 2 great dance researchers, Sergei Vikarev in Russia and Gian-Andrea Poesio here in Britain, and this is for them. Giselle, well, the late great Nestor MacDonald, like her fictional counterpart Miss Jane Marple, held hard to the dictum, "I never believe anyone." I hold her to be my mentor, and more, I think they were certainly on the right track. And bearing that in mind, what happens when we look back into the history of the dance? Well, the first thing one encounters is a very, very old prejudice, an attitude that dance equals steps. And if you don't have steps, you don't have a dance, or you don't have anything really worth worrying about, or anything that concerns the present. It might be interesting, but it's not helpful or important. But if we dig deeper, and archaeology, I suppose, is all about the digging, one discovers that a great deal of the past is still there in one form or another. And if we examine that material, we begin to find that things are not quite how we imagined, and they're certainly not what we were told. Now, Giselle is an ideal subject for any archaeological investigation. Not only is there plenty of material, but the results really do matter because the ballet is still widely performed today. In the 1970s, I shared an office at Festival Ballet with the conductor Graham Bond, and remember his excitement on returning from Paris with 8 new bars for Giselle. Now, I can't remember how many different productions of Giselle I've seen. It's a lot. My personal record was 3 different productions on the same day. London certainly has its advantages. So if we're looking for original features in Giselle, where do we look? And what exactly are we looking for? And here we encounter the main problem. Not of any lack of material, but of far too much. And today, I'm going to restrict myself to the visual material and some of the texts, a few of the texts. There is much, much more mileage in the music. The scores, published and unpublished, and particularly the violin rehearsal score, which is annotated with mine, now in Russia. There's a microfilm of it in the New York Public Library, but I don't think it's available in this country. The most obvious source, and probably the source most often quoted, is that very decorative and informative volume, The Beauties of the Opera and Ballet, published by Heath in London in 1845 and by Sully in Paris in the previous year. There was also a printed scenario issued for the Paris premiere and available so that the first night audience could keep an eye on the unfamiliar action. We all know it now, it was new to them. You may be aware of the scenario from Beaumont's book, The Ballet Called Giselle, but a much more accurate translation is contained in Marion Smith's indispensable Opera and Ballet in the Age of Giselle. The article in Beauties is written by Théophile Gautier. Gautier had had the original idea for the ballet, but should we therefore take anything he writes as in any way superior? Is it more authentic? The Beauties of the Ballet text is certainly more available, and it's often given more weight. Let's excavate that a little more closely. The English version, produced in 1845, is a translation, though imperfect, of the French production, which was issued, as French productions very often were, in monthly instalments. And the first instalment was Giselle, and was issued on the 15th of May, 1844. Each section, each production, was embellished with an engraved portrait of the main protagonist. Here, Carlotta Grisi. As Giselle, the steel engraving by H. Robinson, and the watercolour by A.E. Chalon, the watercolour now in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Now, Robinson worked in London, but he often engraved for French artists, such as Lamy. But did Chalon depict Grisi in Paris or in London? Chalon is the great artist of the Romantic Ballet. I can't resist showing you another. This one. This is another bit from the Beauties of the Opera. Fanny Cherito as Ondine, and the original oil painting, which I excavated in Nottingham last year. You'll note that the window is quite high there, and this has been turned into a French window by the engraver. He obviously thought that that's a mistake. But in fact, if you look at the little woodcuts of the ballet, Ondine, you will see that during the performance, she jumps out of the window over this sill. But before we even leave the title page, we should look at it in more detail. Now, I have seen Will-o'-the-Wisps on stage, I think in Edinburgh, and they certainly feature in the Markova Dollin televised Act 2. They torment the hunters at the beginning of the act and chase them from the stage. And we can find them here in the decorative border design of Beauties of the Opera. Here in the bottom, we have baskets of grapes with butterflies. The butterfly is an ancient symbol of the ephemeral nature of life and love. And clockwise, here we have the huntsman's horn, spears, and 2 lovebirds. Along the top, the owl of night, the Bathild's necklace is in there, and the marguerites, which are used in the He Loves Me Not section. And here, the will-o'-the-wisps, the grave, the armorial shield, and the deadly sword. Almost all the props you need to produce a production of the ballet. The sword itself has an important point to play, but does Giselle actually stab herself? The scenario says not. It says Bertha, her mother, snatches it away from her. But in the English version of the Beauties, it says, she seized the sword and sought to plunge it in her side. The rapid hand of Lois dashed the weapon aside, but not before a deep and fatal wound had pierced the young and innocent maiden's breast. Now, how you can be going for the side and end up with choreographers will have to work that one out. But in the text, it says she stabs herself. In the scenario, she doesn't. It's probably was meant to be a proper stab, a suicide. Otherwise, why is she buried in the middle of the forest? If she did have a heart attack and collapse, she would be in the local churchyard, which wouldn't make a good ballet. The first text page, page 3, each gathering has a title page, a blank, then the first printed page. You see the first of the woodcuts which decorate the text. This gives a good idea of the stage setting for Act 1, but in doing that, it does give the impression of a sort of semi-enclosed area in which all the action takes place. It's quite a small area, but there's a lot to go on there. The other 3 wood blocks here they are variants of this Act 1 set. But is this the Paris Opera setting or the production at Her Majesty's Theatre? Both settings would be similar, but in Paris there always had to be more room here to bring in the horses. I don't know what it is about the Paris Opera. They seem to have horses in all productions. Possibly somebody was doing a scam. I think all these woodcuts do actually belong to the Paris settings. Page 15 shows us the woodland setting of Act 2. And we've got Giselle's grave, the lookout for Miltha, and the handy lake in which to drown victims. But there's not much room for dancing amidst all this greenery. Again, the next 3 are variants of the same setting. As ever, depicted as real landscape, artists simply cannot resist turning a stage set of flats and boards and scenery into a proper landscape setting. And in the same way, I think Gautier's text is similarly biased. He tells us the story of Giselle, but he does not tell us the ballet of Giselle. And wherever we see or hear Lois, the hero, supposedly, named Albrecht rather than Albert, someone has made a value judgment and placed the Gautier story above the text of the scenario or of the score. He's Albert in the scenario, he's Albert in the score, but he's Albrecht. It's actually Albrecht in most modern productions, I think because they take this Gautier text as being more important. If we seek to find other impressions of the Act 2, we have only to look at the French music. These three are by Celestine Nanteuil, and this by Dollet. Here we have Giselle coming through the bulrushes, up a tree, floating across the stage, and sinking into the air. There's plenty of visual material. And in London, where Gracie danced Giselle, you have this, and this is slightly a Giselle background, but really the backgrounds of Brandard's music titles are decorative, but it will give us a good idea of what the costumes actually look like. But do all these images, souvenirs of the production, give us more than an impression of what was seen by the audience in 1841? It's easy to think they do, but as ever, it depended on where you sat. When I was in the box office at Covent Garden in younger and happier days, we used to sell tickets, I'm sure many of you will remember them, clearly stamped restricted view. And despite explaining exactly what that meant, often had to deal with customers who came back to complain that they could not see the whole of the stage. Now, before you all give thanks that you were never offered this seat, we are in box 28 at the Paris Opera in the Rue Le Petier. The box seats were loose, and you could have moved close to the rail. Others, for some punters, of course, going to the opera had very little to do with watching the performance. Others paid more attention. The ballet was reviewed in the Dresdner Abendzeitung by a young and unimpressed Richard Wagner. Wagner was seldom impressed by other composers, particularly those who were still alive. And he must have heard the stories of the composer writing the entire score in a fortnight. It certainly wasn't true. It was 2 or 3 months' work. But Adam did produce the score in double quick time. And he did this in part by using particular musical themes for particular characters and situations and weaving these into the musical score. These themes are leitmotifs. The Willys theme, for example, occurs in Act 1, and the music of the Pas de Deux and the He Loves Me Not are woven into the end of Act 1 Mad scene. I'm sure when Wagner came to write The Ring some years later, he had forgotten all about Mr. Adam. The stage at the Paris Opera was enormous, and it had a wide apron on the front. This is obviously Naples, possibly La Muette de Portici with Vesuvius about to go off, the inevitable man on a horse. I don't know that there is a man on a horse in La Muette de Portici, but what this does is it shows you that the artists, as they did with the scenery, as well as converting sets into landscapes, artists depicting the theatre are very reluctant to show any of the sources of lighting. At the Paris Opera, the great chandelier is often featured, but then it was one of the great glories of the theatre. We can see here, from a woodcut of a later production of Giselle in the 1860s, that there were floats along the front of the apron of the stage, producing some light from below, but the great amount of lighting is in the auditorium. This apron of the stage was always the best lit. And the majority of the light came not just from above, but from above in the auditorium. The amount of light in the backstage area was quite small. Here's a sideways view of the same. You can see the huge chandelier, and here, I think this is the 1860s, so there will be gas lights. and the notorious omnibus boxes, where people would go just to see the bits that they wanted to see rather than the whole performance. In this backstage view at the opera, you can see that there's only a limited opportunity for lighting in the wings and the backstage area. There are lamps here. This man is trimming a lamp, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lamps here on this piece of scenery. And here are gas lights, which will be taken up into the up. So there's not much room for any particular lighting. The opportunities for lighting effects would be very limited. Any backstage and effect lighting, of course, was always a source of danger, and a number of dancers died as a result of lighting-related accidents. Here in London, at Her Majesty's Theatre in the Haymarket, the home of the London Opera, there was also a large apron stage, and the majority of the dancing would have taken place on it, as would most of the action where bits of the set were not involved. There was always a forestage or apron in the Restoration Theatre, but at Her Majesty's, earlier the King's Theatre, mean managements had encroached on the stage area by constructing extra tiers of boxes back behind the original proscenium arch onto the stage. The original proscenium actually was here with the coat of arms, and this is the original proscenium arch, so there's extra. And on this plan, you can see that the boxes, this is the wall, this is the stone wall of the original proscenium arch, and the boxes go much further. It makes the stage smaller, but think of all that extra income from those boxes. The Illustrated London News started 3 months after Giselle, so unfortunately they didn't cover it. But this woodcut of Cerito, Divertissement l'Élève d'Amour, shows Perrault partnering Cerito in the summer of 1842. If you can cast your mind back to those tiny figures on the big stage, these are really rather enormous figures. This ballerina, the size of the conductor. One thing we ought to do is to do a scale model of the theatres and get scale figures and put them on, just to see how odd some of these, I mean, the size of this figure compared to these members of the audience. And unless I'm mistaken and Cerito was in fact a giant, but I think we would have been told. In Giselle, there is practical action with the set, both in Act 1, where there are 2 doors and 1 window, which get practical use. And in Act 2, there are a minimum of 2 trapdoors. In Giselle, the trapdoors were needed for the appearance of Giselle in Act 2 and for her descent at the end of the ballet. These would, of course, all have been beyond the proscenium arch, upstage. This is an earlier theatre, but you can see the number of trapdoors available. These are the floats, and this the proscenium arch. So they're all quite far backstage. One of the reasons that Giselle has remained in the repertoire so consistently is its brilliant creation of an eerie and magical space in Act 2. As with the earlier Nuns Ballet in Robert le Diable, the space in it is inhabited by the undead who have risen from their graves. In Giselle, their clear mission is to kill, and indeed they succeed. This is much more a Gothic ballet than a romantic one. It owes much more to Mary Shelley than to Jane Austen or Walter Scott. And it does this by the use of lighting effects and stage tricks. Now, we're all accustomed to special effects in the cinema, but the 19th century stage delighted in all kinds of stage trickery. And much flying and floating was achieved by the use of trucks, wires, and trapdoors. We've seen a willy up a tree, in Nantoy's music title. This is how it was achieved. This from a book on stage effects as late as 1895. Now, I've seen Giselle up a tree dropping flowers onto a Albert, and I think it was a Russian production. Does the Russians still do it? This is, of course, flying, floating, coming up, zooming across the stage. This is, of course, not how Giselle rises from the grave, however convincing it looks. This is how she comes out of the grave. She has a shroud on. All the willies, when they made their first appearance, had shrouds. Nowadays, a flimsy shroud is whisked off Giselle by a stagehand with a fishing rod or something similar. But in the original production, I'm not so sure. My money is on the shroud slipping backwards into the grave, where it wouldn't catch on her wings. And you think it would be pulled behind. All the theatres had trapdoors. Hamlet, you see here, requires two, one for the ghost, one for the grave, at least. But zooming across the stage at speed and floating gently in the air, to say nothing of flying, are all part of the stage effects repertoire. And you can see here that the skateboard is alive and well in 1841. These last two woodcuts are by Alcide Joseph Lorentz, and a splendid instance of the caricaturist serving the serious iconographer. He published a rather vicious parody of Giselle in the Paris magazine Musée Philippon in 1842. And the next year, some of the designs were copied into an English production called The Comic Album. This kind of piracy was not unusual, and many of the actual blocks used for the Illustrated London News reviews of the ballet ended up in German newspapers. The original Lorentz blocks appeared again in the 1860s when Giselle was revived at the opera. Now, these 22 blocks of the Musée Philippon are an excellent alternative source. Here, got page 1 and 2. This is Hilarion, Lois, or Albert, and Wilfrid, much better dressed. Confrontation between Lois and Hilarion, Giselle and her mother, and the entrance of all the nobility on no less than 3 horses. And these are the other blocks that take us through. We'll see some of them a little later. In Act 2, the first people on the scene are a group of hunters who are warned of their danger by Hilarion and then chased off by the will-o'-the-wisps. It's very often cut, but in the Mary Skeeping production, it certainly was used. Hilarion, having escaped, returns later to his doom, but in most productions, their exit is an end to the gentleman of the Corps de Ballet's work for the evening, but not in 1841. Lorentz shows us the hunters with Hilarion. They have Didymen hats, but these are the peasants, and immediately after Giselle is called from the grave, she exits and a group of peasants come on. They have brimmed hats, and they are only saved from the willies by the intervention, according to the satire, of Frère Philippe. The score of 1841 gives us a cast list, and there's no sign of Frère Philippe, but Monsieur Petit is un viard, an old man, and I think he's the one who saves them and gets them off into the wings. But the Lorentz caricature certainly implies that the willie have begun to dance with the villagers, which concurs with both the score and with the scenario. If you go back to the score and the scenario, they dance with the villagers. It's omitted in all the modern productions, and the incident, strangely, doesn't appear in Gautier's text. Now, a comparison with the original costume designs and some souvenir prints give us an idea of the accuracy of the caricaturist's eye. Here we can see Hilarion en caricature, and this a huntsman's costume in the Paris Opera archive. He carries a spear, so presumably the intended game is stag or boar. And here we have Wilfrid and Lois, Albert in disguise, and there's a costume from one of the many costume series produced in France. Sadly, they produced the first act costume for Petipa, but do not show us the second act costume. Here is Bertha and Giselle, these two souvenir prints of Bertha. Original design for her headdress, original design for Giselle's bodice. This, one of the Martinet series showing as it appeared in the theatre. And I've seen this. This is a design for Giselle for the ballet, which is in the Paris Opera archive. And I've seen it reproduced a number of times as the original costume for Giselle. It's not. It's the costume for the young ladies of the Corps de Ballet. They do this, there's 8 of them. They are the vine gatherers. And here, the peasant pas de deux, danced in the original by Mabille and Natalie Fitzjames. Lots of visual material. They're not exactly the same, so I think this one may be a slightly different production, slightly later. The pas de deux with Petipa and Grisi in Act 1. I'll let you decide which you think is the most accurate. And the action of Act 1. Here are the nobility arriving. Here's Hilarion going into the window. Hilarion doesn't get a good crit, really. He doesn't get a good... he's not got much to do. In the original production, he certainly did more dancing. Nowadays, Hilarion is mainly a mime role, but he's got to be agile. He's got to get into a window. Here, the figure of Bacchus, and Giselle made Queen of the Vintage. Queen of the Vintage is still done to this day in places where they make wine. A young maiden is made the Queen of the Vintage. Usually Bacchus or the barrel comes in on a cart these days, health and safety. And if any of you know Scottish Ballet's production, they used to have an adult Bacchus, a part which John Aitken used to do splendidly well. Whether it was Bacchus and whether it was Silenus, I'm not sure. Albert's costume for Act 2, it survives in the Paris Opera archive. And from the caricature, you said this is pretty close to what's going on. But these later ones, it does look as though there's been some change. Possibly, a dancer said, I can't dance in all that. It's just too, there's just too much of it. And that it's being simplified. Because there's a lot of images with this rather simplified tabard, and there's not all this sort of skirting. Today, we all expect that the willies look the same. But the two solos for the big willies, as opposed to the big swans and Swan Lake, who are named Moina and Zulma, are supposed to be a German and an Indian bayadere. The original idea was that the willies were of different nationalities and they would be wearing their different national costumes. But that idea didn't make it to the performance, though there is evidence of different national dances in the score. Nobody obviously told Adam. This figure here, though, I think is the Bayadere, Zoma. She's got her hair down and she's wearing a sort of sari. This is Giselle dropping the flowers. This, I think, Mirtha and Albert. It's altogether rather a peculiar mixture. Giselle's. Parisian icons of Giselle, that's the top row, are much more uncommon than London ones, as in the bottom row. Some of them, I think this is first, so I think somebody's been doing a little bit of pinching in here. And this is the design for the original costumes of the Willies from the Paris Opera archive. You can see it's very different from the way it ends up. And the wings, I think the angels' wings were just thought, no, it's not good enough. So they turned into these, I don't know quite how you describe them. They're a bit like butterflies' wings, but they have peacock feathers sewn onto them. Why were there so many in London? Why were there so few in Paris? And I think the reason for that is that London took Giselle to its heart. I should say England took Giselle, as the first British production was actually in Brighton with Gilbert and Balin, and a play on the subject of Giselle was seen at Sadler's Wells before the opera premiere. Begin to get some of the differences between the productions. A London review in the Times says of Grisi, in this scene there was one touch particularly fine. It was the sudden paroxysm of unearthly joy which took possession of the hitherto quiet spectre when first made a Willie by the imposition of a crown on her head. One rapid whirl marked the transition from the inhabitant of the grave to the reckless sprite. Well, we're used to that today. We see that. Giselle comes out very demure and suddenly does all these spirited turns, usually now by the Queen of the Willies touching Giselle. But in the original London production, she's given a crown. And you can see that all of these images, she has a crown of roses with a star in the middle. And that's something you do not see on any of the French icons. Giselle goes on to be a hit in many other countries, but it is as Perrault's Giselle, Perrault's ballet, that we know it. Well, Perrault did not dance in the ballet's premiere in Paris, and his name does not appear anywhere on the poster. In fact, it doesn't appear anywhere in the scenario. Is it therefore the London production where Perrault danced and had a free hand, which we should consider as the sort of standard Giselle, the one that goes out to all the other places? Well, this caricature of 1843, Perrault was only 33, may give us some idea as to why he preferred to dance in London or St. Petersburg. It's Perrault in Giselle as an ancient, crippled old man. At 33, he was still at the height of his powers. But Perrault had come up through the boulevard theatres in Paris. He wasn't a Paris Opera product. And I think some people at the Paris Opera and some people in the audience never let him forget that. Now, at this point, I think we need to do some housekeeping. One of the great joys of being a historian of any kind, is hunting down the mistakes of previous generations. I hope subsequent generations take an equal pleasure in hunting down mine. And a few of you may be just old enough to remember 1969, when the great Irish actress Anna Manahan, who played Milo O'Shea's ancient mother in a production called Me Mammy, spent one episode hunting through the house, hunting for saints, statues of saints who had been demoted by the Pope, and putting them in the bin. I'm afraid a similar situation will now arise with Giselle icons. Well, they remain Giselle icons. They are just not icons of Perrault's ballet. The first two are these two lovely lithographs of Emma Harding as Mirtha. Beautiful things. And Sarah Jane Woolgar en travesti as Albert at the Adelphi Theatre in 1847. They come from a burlesque entitled The Phantom Dancers or the Willie's Bride, which starred the great Paris-trained dancer Céline Celeste as Giselle. Although a burlesque, a send-up of the original, both a send-up of the original ballet and the operas based on it, there was plenty of dancing, and it provided a fitting vehicle for Celeste. And here's Celeste and Woolgar at the end of at the denouement of the burlesque, where it's a bit like Sleeping Beauty, where all the pantomime characters come on at the end. This is the devil, this is a Bayadere, this is Britannia, this is Napoleon. I don't know what Napoleon's doing in there. But I suppose he did try and get in everywhere. The burlesque of the 1840s is not, I'm afraid we're in difficulties with the word burlesque as it is used today, of people scantily clad and being rather vulgar on the stage. Some of these burlesques were extremely clever and tasteful. And my favorite is a send-up of La Bayadere, which was called The Bayadere or The Maid of Kashmir. And a burlesque immediately came out at one of the minor theatres saying, "Buy it, dear, 'tis made of cashmere." They love wordplay, and that kind of wordplay and that kind of burlesque tradition goes off in one direction and becomes things like the Gilbert and Sullivan, where wordplay and light satire. The other path is towards the more vulgar, which goes to America and comes back, and we'll talk about that. But while we're talking about America, at Harvard, there is this lovely, lovely, lovely watercolour, which has been identified as Giselle. Now, I'm afraid I don't think it is. I think these stockings with lace on them, it's much more 17th century. I think this might be the ballet Betty or the Wags of Wapping. Of course, it may be an American production, in which case it could be anything at all. And the Staffordshire figures. I'm sorry. Now, Staffordshire figures, most Staffordshire figures are based on prints, and these are no exception. The source print is this. And it's an engraving from the musical Bouquet series, published in 1845. Well, the man is sort of based on the man in the music print, and this lady is definitely Carlotta Grisi as Giselle, but is the dancing partner Giselle? I'm afraid I don't think so. There's probably another source print out there which actually gives, which is exactly in that pose. Another. This is a lithograph by Brandard, a music title. See, it's got Giselle there, so it must be Giselle. And it's often reproduced in books on ballet. And because the Albert has a moustache and beard, it's often labelled as Arthur Saint Leon and his partner Fanny Charité. It's not, and the clue to its proper identification is simply looking at an untrimmed or uncropped example. It's the Night Dancers waltzes. Here's another one of the Night Dancers quadrille. It's the opera by Edward Loder, done at the Royal Italian Opera in Covent Garden in the 1860s. The figures are Madame Palmieri as Giselle and Mr. Haig as Albert, but they look very like Pine and Harrison, who headed the Covent Garden Company. I'm afraid Mr. Brandard wasn't very good at likeness. But it's in the, and there's another couple of American versions, say the opera of Giselle, but the music is by Loder. This is very often produced in books on ballet, and here again sung in The Night Dancers. Things very often went to America, but they sort of changed en route. It's in the denouement of the ballet that we find the greatest distance from the original. Modern productions usually end with the shade of Giselle slipping through the hands of Albert and returning to her grave. She usually bourrées off behind the grave mound into the wings and leaves Albert, often clutching a flower, to walk down the front centre stage alone and in despair as the curtain falls. The original's not like that at all. In the original, Wilfrid has not been inactive. He has gone for help, and its arrival is heralded by hunting horns, which we can hear in the score shortly after the bell strikes. When the bell strikes for the morning and the Willie's spell breaks, very shortly after that, you can hear in the distance the hunting horns. Giselle does attempt to return to her grave, but is prevented by Albert, who catches her and carries her over to the other side of the stage, where he lays her down on a bed of flowers in the opposite corner. There, she slowly sinks into the earth. The flowers come and go over her. As she descends, she plucks a rose from the rose bush to give to Albert and presents him with it, and then points him in the direction of Bathill. Bathill's on the way, again on the horse. And his final act is to reach out his arms, not to Giselle, Giselle has disappeared, to Bathill. Giselle might have forgiven him, but I don't know that we ought to. So much for the romantic hero. Giselle may have forgiven him, but Albert is, I'm sorry to say, a two-timing scum who is quite prepared to settle for the alternative woman, having killed the one that he was in love with first. Still, one cannot imagine that they lived happily ever after. Well, such has been a preliminary excavation. A first season's results, or a 3-day time team trawling through the material. Clearly, there is much more to learn, weaving the visual material through the many and various texts and fitting the action to each individual bar of the music. As I said before, building a scale model would allow us to give the proper scale to everything, and simply trying it out with some dancers. I very much approve of this Edinburgh school, where they have a combined seat and Giselle's grave, it combines them both, for playground reconstructions. It's just the sort of innovation which will encourage the next generation of dance scholars. And so we return to the grave. Should we let poor Giselle rest in peace? I think not. Let's carry on digging. Thank you.
Well, I think we've opened a can of worms, apart from a grave.
Excellent.
Lots to think about there. I must say I was particularly struck by your comments at the beginning about the Gautier scenario not matching up probably with what happened on stage. I've had my own experiences of talking to choreographers who've handed the story to me, and I say, but that doesn't happen on stage. And so you know from the word, oh no, you must put my story in, not what happens on stage. So, right, it's still going on, that audiences are being deliberately misled. Historians are having red herrings put in their way. And so obviously being an archaeologist is going to become what we need in the dance world. Now, I'm sure there's lots of questions out there. There's one at the back, right?
When did it become traditional for Giselle to be dressed in blue? Because that's how it's performed now in Act 1. She's always in blue.
I have
Not
seen
always.
Not always.
Not always.
But I have. Was Markova in blue?
Yes, but I think Markova is always following the Ballet Russe, and of course Cassavana was in blue.
Well, I think that answers your question. I think it comes from the. One of the things I think we could do, given enough time and energy, is to produce. Do you remember there was a program on television called Rock Family Trees? Well, I think it'd be wonderful to do ballet family trees, where you look at the productions and see who was in different productions. I know that the Mary's Keeping goes back to Pavlova. Pavlova goes back to Marius Petipa, and of course Marius Petipa to Lucien Petipa. And there's this Russian tradition. It stays in the repertoire in Russia almost all the way through, but it's done in Paris in the 80s. Just putting all the productions in line and seeing who was in them and who turns up 20 years later in another production would be, I think, a very useful exercise.
I think also something you might like to comment on, the whole problem about hand-coloured prints. So you ended up with different variants, and therefore there is the challenge of making sense of them.
Well, the original designs are original designs. Very often, what ends up on stage is very different from the designer's original concept. You see that particularly in Bakst. And then when it's produced on the stage, artists go to the theatre, they look at the productions, and with things like Martinet, I think what they do is they do a sketch of the costume, or they're allowed in to do a sketch of the dancer in the costume, and they colour it accurately. I think the French costume series are generally accurate colouring, but most prints were produced in black and white, and there's nothing to stop anybody. The one I showed you of Giselle Act 2 by Brandard is coloured pink. It's not coloured pink, it's a black and white music sheet. Somebody has coloured it pink. Have you ever seen pink Giselles? Pink Willies? No, no, no. The very idea. No, 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 no.
Further questions? Yes.
Not a good question, but just a comment on how Giselle dies. And not so long ago, there were 3 different ballerinas at the Opera House who all died in different ways.
Oh.
So I think perhaps they choose their own way. It was either having a heart attack, plunging the night into themselves, which I think wasn't allowed in Catholic countries, suicide, and just falling on the sword.
I've seen all 3. I've seen Giselle's have the sword snatched away. I've seen them in the air as if to properly stab themselves. And I've seen them all also. I think the Festival Ballet one was generally she ran forward onto the sword. So it's sort of is it an accident? Is it deliberate? But it's very peculiar that the score, that the scenario says that definitely her mother takes the sword away. But of course, if her mother takes the sword away and she doesn't stab herself, what's she doing buried in the unconsecrated ground? It doesn't quite fit. But of course, if it was a church thing, that would certainly explain why they'd removed it.
Oh, thank you. That was really very interesting. Another way of supporting a Gothic take on Giselle we had endorsed is, have you looked at the libretto of the Sadler's Bells production, the 1841 production?
The play, yeah.
Yes, the play. Well, yes, a lot of dancing and a lot of singing, and he used the Adam score as well.
All right.
And there's a copy in the British Library. But it's very Gothic. It's Gothic in being set in Germany. It's Gothic in the characters. And they brought the water on, because that was you could take them on the stage and have the real water. So you had Merthyr coming on and surrounded by fountain and water.
Splendid.
But bizarrely, it has a happy ending, and Giselle goes back to Hilarion. Out there, it's forgotten.
Oh, but
she stayed because she had Catholic cross.
Right.
So but it's very Gothic.
Well, I think the waters are to Sadler's Wells what the horses are to the Palace Opera. And of course, the opera versions by Loda all have a happy ending. It's a dream. It's a terrible dream, and she wakes up and all's well. Bit of a tired old one, that, but it seemed to work.
Are you familiar? Have you encountered any images of the production in St. Petersburg?
No, there are some tiny little figures in a book by Soloviev of Dancers with Wings, but I think they're more likely to be La Sylphide than Giselle. It's very peculiar that the Russians were ballet mad, but they imported the ballet prints for the most part. There are a dozen native ballet prints. They are fabulous, but they are extraordinarily rare. I'm sure the collector in mind won't mind me saying that, but there's a particular one of Taglioni in Daughter of the Danube, where she's standing on a balustrade. And when they did the book of Romantic Ballet in lithographs at the time in 1938, they say, well, we're showing you this from Soloviev's book because there is no copy in the West. And indeed, we thought there was no copy in the West, but Markova had one. And when Mr. Gill and I went to look at the Markova papers over at Boston, we thought we might try and find out where this had come from. And she had, well, I suppose nowadays we would call her a stalker, but she had a mad fan who presented her with prints and drawings and things, and would like little letters and say, "Oh, Madam Markova, I found this. I think you'd like it, so do have it." And you think, she'd say things like, "I found a wonderfully coloured copy of the Pas de Quatre. I know you have it in black and white, but I think you'll like this coloured one. And by the way, I found the Soloviev Daughter of the Danube. I do have that too." And we're going, no. Markova must have had it not in the time when the book was being produced in 1938, but she certainly had it in the 70s when Ed Binney was doing his exhibition of Taglioni prints at Harvard. And he knew Markova, and Markova knew him. but she must just have kept quiet. She must have forgot, like Wagner, she must have forgotten that she had it. So many lovely things.
Thank you very much, so fascinating. You reminded me, but it's so vague, it's almost embarrassing to raise it, to apologize to everybody. You mentioned that at the end of the second act, Giselle returns to the grave and points to the original. Yes. The names in Italian on the page. And I remember that my father gave me the record set of Giselle by Richard
Bonning, yes.
And there's a long story there. And there they refer back, if I remember, to either the funeral march. So there was a difference in time. The time is, or something about, or a wedding with I don't know. But are those things? I'm sorry, I can tell you tomorrow if you like.
Richard Bonning's recording. Richard Bonning is one of the unsung heroes of the ballet because his recordings of ballet scores. He went to Paris. He researched the score. If you listen to Richard Bonning's recordings of Giselle, you think, what on earth is that? I've never heard that before. And so many things that were in the original production, which have been subsequently cut out. And a lot of the mime scenes have been either cut out or cut down. If you think of the ballet in the 19th century, I always think it's much more like watching the silent cinema to an orchestra. You're getting melodrama, you're getting wonderful acting, and you're not getting, it's not opera, it's not staged, you're not getting any text over, but you're getting the actions. And it's no surprise that people like Dolan, from a ballet background, did early silent cinema. A lot of the people in the early silent cinema came from a ballet or a theatre background where they were used to expressing themselves physically without words, unlike Sarah Bernhardt. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures of Sarah Bernhardt. Somebody must have told her it was silent. But, and I'm sure some lip reader can add to that. Yes.
They would cut it because of theatre, or
they would cut it because somebody along the line would think, "Oh, I don't like that bit." Yeah. It's not. Oh, we haven't got a horse. Like, we'll cut the horses. We haven't got many men in the corps de ballet. We'll cut the villagers. A lot of things change. A lot of things change just because they change, and people forget things, and people remember them wrongly. But they generally are cut down because it's cheese paring. Things are being made a little bit cheaper.
I'd like to ask you a question. Which productions of Giselle on stage today or in recent history have you found most satisfying? And are there any you would like to see?
Well, as I said, I've seen a lot, and I've seen some very peculiar Giselles. I saw the wonderful one that the Dance Theatre of Harlem did, which was set in the Louisiana swamps, and people coming out of those graves on top of the earth. That was wonderful, particularly the Mytha, who was about 8 foot tall and scared me. I mean, I was in the audience. I think the Mary Skeeping. I have wonderful memories of the Mary Skeeping production because there was so much going on, and it felt authentic. And I mean, that's not scholarly. It just felt authentic to me. And it depends who's doing the Giselle. I'm sorry, I never saw Markova because she has the reputation of being the great interpreter. But I saw Barbieri do it, and she was lovely. And Eva Evdokimova. I saw her do Giselle and Sylphide. And, you know, there are certain dancers who you can go, that dancer has it. Whatever it is, whatever quality it is that you're looking for, they have it. And I'm sorry to say there are those that you go, They don't. I'm not going to name them.
Do we have any last questions on that point, apart from asking the names?
My lips are sealed.
If not, thank you for a fascinating evening.